Before we start, if you enjoy the story, please leave a like and check if you're subscribed. The wind bit through 3 layers of insulation like they were tissue paper. Ethan Cross kept his head down, boots crunching through knee-deep powder as the blizzard screamed around him. He'd been checking his trapline when the sky tore open, a streak of fire that carved through the storm and vanished beyond the ridge. Not a meteor. Meteors didn't course correct. He found the trail 20 minutes later. Trees snapped at their bases, bark scorched black. The snow glowed faintly violet where something had bled across it. His breath came sharp and visible as he followed the furrow uphill, rifle slung across his back more from habit than conviction. Whatever had crashed here, bullets probably wouldn't help. The pod sat half buried in a drift, metal still radiating heat that turned the surrounding snow to slush. It was small, organic in design, panels sealed so seamlessly he couldn't tell where one ended and another began. A fracture ran along one side, leaking steam in that strange, violet luminescence. Ethan circled it once, then twice, before touching the metal with his bare hand. Warm, but not burning. He wedged his fingers into the crack and pulled. The hatch gave with a hiss of escaping atmosphere. The smell hit him first, ozone and something floral he couldn't name. Then he saw her. She was small. That registered before anything else. Curled on her side in a space barely large enough to contain her, bleeding from a gash that ran from ribcage to hip. Her skin was pale, almost translucent in the pod's dying light, and her hair fell in waves of vivid orange-red across her face. But it was the ears that stopped him cold. Large and triangular, covered in soft orange fur, lying flat against her skull. And behind her, half-pinned beneath her body, a tail as thick and fluffy as any fox he'd ever seen, matted with violet blood. Ethan's field training kicked in before his disbelief could. He stripped off his outer jacket, bundled it around her torso to compress the wound, and lifted her from the pod. She weighed almost nothing. He adjusted his grip, careful not to jostle the tail trapped between them, and started back toward the cabin. The storm covered his tracks within minutes. He kicked the cabin door open and laid her on the table, sweeping aside maps and a half-finished meal. The wound was deep, edges clean like a blade cut. Violet fluid pulsed weakly with each shallow breath. He grabbed his medical kit, hands steady despite the surreality, and threaded the curved needle. Her eyes snapped open as the first stitch went in. They were amber, shot through with gold, the pupils vertical slits that dilated in panic. She lunged upward with a sound between a hiss and a scream, and he barely caught her wrists before claws he hadn't noticed raked across his chest. They tumbled backward, the table screeching across the floor. She was impossibly strong for her size, twisting in his grip with feral desperation. Then her body went rigid, eyes rolling back, and she collapsed into his arms like a puppet with cut strings. Ethan lowered her back to the table, breathing hard. The wound had reopened, violet spreading across his jacket. He worked quickly after that, stitching the gash closed with the kind of focus that left no room for questions. When he finished, he wrapped her in wool blankets and moved her to his bed, tucking the tail carefully alongside her body. It was longer than he'd realized, easily 3 feet, the fur dense and impossibly soft where it wasn't crusted with blood. She didn't wake that night or the next day. Ethan kept the fire burning and the cabin warm, changing her bandages every few hours. The violet blood dried to a rust color, almost brown. Her breathing evened out. Once, when he was replacing the compress on her forehead, her ears twitched forward slightly before flattening again. He took it as a good sign. On the second evening, he was boiling water for broth when he felt her watching him. He turned slowly, hands visible. She was sitting upright, blankets pooled around her waist, one hand pressed to her bandaged side. Her ears swiveled toward him, tracking his movement with predatory precision. The tail lay still behind her, wrapped partway around her hip. "Easy," he said, keeping his voice low. "You're safe here." Her head tilted, the eyes narrowed. He ladled broth into a wooden bowl, set it on the chair between them, and backed away to the far wall. She stared at him for a long moment, then at the bowl, then back at him. Her ears flicked once. Confusion, maybe, or suspicion. Finally, she reached for it, movements stiff with pain. She sniffed the contents, took a cautious sip, and drank it all without looking away from him. It became their pattern. He offered food and water. She accepted in tense silence. He changed her bandages while she watched him with unblinking intensity, her tail coiled protectively around herself. When he demonstrated that the door was unlocked, that she could leave whenever she wanted, her ears lifted slightly. Surprise, or the beginning of it, but she stayed. A week passed. The wound began to heal, the edges knitting with a speed that fascinated him. She started moving around the cabin, studying his tools and supplies with methodical interest. He heard her repeat words under her breath, mimicking the sounds he made when he talked to himself while working. One morning he handed her a knife and a piece of wood, mimed carving. She took it without hesitation, and by evening she'd shaped it into something angular and precise, covered in symbols he couldn't read. The infection came on the 9th day. He noticed the fever first, her skin burning when he touched her forehead to check. The wound had reddened around the stitches, violet streaks spreading beneath the pale skin. She was lucid enough to know what was happening. When he heated the knife blade in the fire, her eyes tracked the motion, and she understood. Ethan knelt beside the bed, knife glowing orange. She bit down on the leather strap he offered, her entire body going rigid, her ears pinned flat against her skull, and the tail lashed once, twice, striking the wall with dull thuds. He pressed the hot metal to the infected tissue. She didn't scream. The sound she made was worse, a high, keening whine that vibrated in her chest and filled the cabin. Her claws tore into the sheets, but she held still, even as her body shook and sweat slicked her skin. When it was over, she spat out the strap and lay panting, eyes closed, ears trembling against her head. Ethan cleaned and rebandaged the wound, his hands gentler than necessary. When he finished, she caught his wrist. Her grip was weak but deliberate. He looked up and met her gaze. Something shifted there. Not trust, not yet, but recognition, an acknowledgement that he could have let her die, could have done 100 other things, and instead he'd chosen this, chosen her survival over his own ease. Her fingers tightened briefly, then released. Outside the wind howled, inside the fire crackled, and between them in the space of that single touch, the first thread of connection pulled taut. The thaw came gradually, measured not in melting snow, but in the slow accumulation of shared language. Saris, she'd offered her name on the 3rd week, tapping her chest with those pale fingers and repeating the word until he understood, began teaching him fragments of her tongue. The sounds were complex, requiring tongue placements his mouth wasn't built for, but he tried. She corrected him with patience that surprised them both, her ears perking forward when he got close to the proper pronunciation. In return, he taught her English. She absorbed it faster than seemed possible, repeating his words with an accent that softened harsh consonants into something musical. When she asked what certain objects were called, he answered. When she pointed to abstract things, the fire's glow, the wind's howl, the silence between them, he gave her those words too. One afternoon, he showed her how to split firewood. She watched his demonstration with focused attention, then took the axe and swung it with precision that spoke of different training. The blade bit deep. She worked through half the pile before he stopped her, pointing to the bandage visible beneath her shirt. She glanced down, ears flicking back, in what he'd learned was embarrassment, and set the axe aside. "Your people," he said that evening as they ate. "They teach you to fight like that?" She nodded, chewing slowly. Her table manners had adapted to human utensils, though she still held the fork like a weapon. "All Kitsara train. Combat, strategy, survival." She paused, searching for words. "We must be strong, controlled." "Controlled how?" "Emotion is..." She frowned, tail swishing behind her in frustration at her linguistic limits. "Weakness. Cloud's judgment. Warriors must be clear, detached." Ethan watched her ears flatten slightly as she spoke, betraying discomfort she couldn't quite hide. "That why you all have those?" He gestured vaguely toward her head. "The ears and tail?" She touched one ear self-consciously. "Yes, our bodies betray feeling, so we learn to master ourselves, to not let them move." As if to prove the point, she went very still, and for a moment the tail stopped its restless motion. Then it twitched, just once, and her jaw tightened. "It is difficult." "Sounds lonely." Her gaze snapped to his, sharp and defensive. Then something in her expression softened, and the ears drooped just slightly. She didn't answer. The next day, she showed him Kitsara combat forms. He expected something rigid, military, but her movements were fluid as water, impossibly quick. She flowed from stance to stance, the tail acting as counterbalance that let her pivot on impossible angles. When she swept his legs out from under him, he hit the floor hard enough to knock his breath away. She offered a hand to pull him up, something almost playful in the tilt of her ears. They sparred after that, careful at first, then with growing intensity. She was faster, but he was heavier, and they found the rhythm between those differences. Once, when he managed to pin her, their faces ended up inches apart. Her breath was quick, eyes bright, and the tail had wrapped partly around his leg without her seeming to notice. They stayed frozen like that for 3 heartbeats before she twisted free, ears flattened in what he couldn't quite read. At night, they sat by the fire and traded stories. He told her about the desert, the sand and heat, and the friends he'd lost there. About the guilt that drove him north, to a place where the cold made everything simple. She told him about the collective, the ships that moved between stars, the code of honor that shaped every Kitsara life from birth. About watching Earth from orbit for generations, studying humanity like a virus that might spread. "Your people think we're dangerous," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she stared into the flames, "reckless, violent, too emotional to be trusted with advanced technology. Maybe we just care too much to play it safe." Her head turned sharply, ears lifting in surprise. She opened her mouth, closed it, then looked away. The tail curled around her feet in a slow, uncertain motion. "That is not. We do not see it that way." The silence that followed felt heavy with things neither of them could name. He took her to town 3 days later, hidden beneath an oversized coat and hat that did nothing to disguise her build but kept the ears covered. Dr. Amara Singh met them at her clinic after hours, eyes widening when Saris removed the coverings. The scientist circled her slowly, clinical fascination warring with wonder. "May I?" Amara gestured to the healing wound. Saris nodded, and Amara examined the site with gentle efficiency. "Remarkable healing rate, and your baseline temperature is lower than ours by several degrees. The musculature here..." She touched Saris's shoulder, tracing the line of alien anatomy. "Denser than human. You're much stronger than you look." "Yes." Amara met Ethan's eyes over Saris's head. "If anyone finds out she's here, government, military, corporate, they'll take her. Dissect her to understand how she works." She looked at Saris again, something fierce in her expression. "I won't tell anyone, but you need to be careful." That night, Saris sat close to Ethan by the fire, closer than she had before. The tail rested against his leg, warm through his jeans. She'd been quiet since they returned, processing Amara's warning, or perhaps something else. "Your friend," she said finally, "she is wise. She's worried about you. She does not know me. Doesn't have to. Some people are just like that. They see someone who needs protecting and they step up." Saris turned to look at him, and in the firelight her eyes were molten amber. "Like you." He didn't answer. Couldn't, really. Instead, he watched as she reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement, and traced the scar on his forearm with one pale finger. The touch was feather-light, curious. When she reached the end of the mark, her hand lingered on his wrist. He covered her hand with his own. Her breath caught. The ears swiveled toward him, fully forward, and the tail shifted against his leg in a slow, sinuous motion. Neither of them moved beyond that, but the touch stretched between them like a bridge across dark water. His thumb brushed across her knuckles. Her fingers turned beneath his palm, lacing partway through his own. The fire crackled. Outside, an owl called. Inside, something fundamental shifted in the space between two beings who were learning to see each other clearly. Then the sound cut through everything else, a high-pitched whine that made Saris jerk upright, ears pinned flat in horror. The noise came from her armor, still piled in the corner where Ethan had stored it weeks ago. A panel had lit up, pulsing in rhythm with the sound. She was across the room in an instant, hands moving over the controls with desperate speed. Her voice fractured on the words. "What is it?" She looked at him, and the fear in her eyes stopped his heart. Emergency beacon. I did not know it would activate. It is broadcasting my location. Her tail had gone rigid, bristling. My people are coming, and when they arrive, they will kill you. The fire popped, the beacon whined, and the fragile world they'd built in this cabin began to crack apart. Cirrus worked through the night trying to deactivate the beacon, her fingers flying over controls that responded to nothing. Ethan watched the frustration build in the rigid set of her shoulders, the way her tail lashed in tight, angry arcs. By dawn, she slumped against the wall, defeated. "How long?" he asked. 2 days, maybe 3 if the storm delays them. She looked at him with something raw in her eyes. "You must leave. Go far from here. They will scan for human biosigns near my location." "No." I said no. He crouched in front of her, meeting her gaze level. "I'm not running." "They will kill you, not out of cruelty, but procedure. You are a witness, a contamination risk." Her voice broke slightly. "Please. I didn't pull you out of that wreck just to let you face your people alone." Her ears flattened completely, and for a moment she looked utterly lost. Then she reached for him, pulling him close with desperate strength, her face pressed against his shoulder, the tail wrapped around his back. He held her while she trembled, saying nothing, because there was nothing to say that would make this easier. The Kitsara arrived on the second day. Ethan heard them before he saw them, a sound like tearing silk as their ship descended through the cloud cover. It was sleek and organic, all curves and seamless panels, settling into the clearing with barely a whisper. The exit hatch opened, and 6 figures emerged. They moved like Ceres, but harder. Their armor was darker, more aggressive, and they fanned out with military precision that made Ethan's old instincts scream warnings. At their center walked an older female, silver threading through the rust-colored fur of her ears. Her tail barely moved at all, perfect control that marked her as someone who'd mastered every weakness her body might betray. Cirrus stepped out of the cabin before Ethan could stop her. She stood between him and her people, spine straight despite the odds, tail held high in challenge rather than fear. "Commander Valen," she said in English, whether for Ethan's benefit or her own defiance, he couldn't tell. "Scout Cirrus." Valen's voice was cold, precise. Her amber eyes swept over Ethan with dismissive assessment before returning to Cirrus. "Your beacon activated 14 days ago. You did not follow emergency protocols. Explain." "I was injured. The human provided medical assistance." "And you allowed this exposure to continue for 2 weeks?" Valen's ears flicked back in disgust. "Your judgment has been compromised. You will return to the ship immediately." "He saved my life. He is a security risk, witness to our technology, our biology. This cannot be allowed." Valen made a sharp gesture, and 2 soldiers raised their weapons, sleek things that hummed with barely contained energy. "Neutralize the human. Retrieve the scout." Cirrus moved before the order finished. She stepped directly into the line of fire, claws extended, tail bristling in open defiance. "No." The clearing went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Valen's eyes narrowed. "You would protect a primitive over your own people?" "I would protect someone who showed me more honor than our code ever did." Cirrus's voice shook, but she didn't move. "He could have killed me, studied me, sold me. Instead, he healed me, fed me, asked nothing in return. That is not primitive. That is strength." "That is contamination." Valen took a step forward and her soldiers mirrored her. "Final warning, Scout. Stand aside or be marked traitor." Ethan's hand found Cirrus's shoulder. "I'm not worth this." "You do not decide your worth to me." The moment stretched thin, ready to snap into violence. Then engines roared from the access road, trucks grinding through snow, carrying Dr. Singh and a hastily assembled group of locals. They formed a ragged line, hunting rifles raised with the kind of desperate courage that comes from defending home. Amara climbed out, her voice carrying across the clearing. "If you fire, we fire. Your technology might be better, but bullets still kill." It was a bluff. Ethan could see that. Valen could too. But it changed the equation from simple execution to massacre, and even the collective had to answer for that. The commander's tail twitched once. Irritation or calculation? One of the younger soldiers broke formation, moving closer to Ceres. His ears were forward, uncertain. "Commander, if I may." "Speak, Kale." "Perhaps exile rather than execution. The collective's reputation is not your concern." But Valan's gaze shifted, measuring the situation with cold pragmatism. A dead human would raise questions. A missing one might not. "Scout Ceres, you understand what you are choosing?" "I do. Then I will make it official." Valan's voice carried across the clearing like judgment. "Ceres of House Valeron, you are hereby stripped of rank and title. You are exiled from the Kitsara Collective, marked as traitor to our people. You will receive no aid, no contact, no return. Choose this path, and you are alone." Ceres's breath hitched. Her ears trembled, flattening against her skull in grief. For a moment, Ethan thought she might break. Then her chin lifted, and she squared her shoulders. "I choose him." Valan's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. She turned to Kale. "Mark it in the record. The traitor and her contamination are no longer our concern." She looked at Ethan then, and her voice dropped to something almost pitying. "When she realizes what she has sacrificed for you, human, I hope you prove worth it." The Kitsara retreated to their ship with military efficiency. Kale was the last to board, and he glanced back once at Ceres. Something conflicted in his posture. Then the hatch sealed, and the ship lifted into the sky, vanishing into clouds as if it had never been. The locals dispersed slowly, confused and shaken. Amara approached carefully, but Ethan waved her off. "Not now, not yet." Ceres stood motionless in the snow, staring at the sky where her people had vanished. Her tail hung limp behind her, ears pressed flat against her head. Then her legs buckled, and she dropped to her knees. Ethan was there before she hit the ground. He knelt beside her, pulling her against his chest as she shook with silent sobs. No sound escaped her, but her whole body convulsed with the weight of what she'd lost. Her claws dug into his jacket, holding on like he was the only solid thing left in her world. He said nothing, just wrapped his arms around her and held on while she grieved for a life that no longer existed. The snow fell around them, soft and relentless, covering the scars of the ship's landing until all that remained was two figures kneeling in the cold, one who had lost everything, and one who refused to let her fall alone. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were red-rimmed but clear. She touched his face with shaking fingers, tracing the line of his jaw, as if memorizing it. "I do not know who I am without them," she whispered. He caught her hand, pressed it against his cheek. "Then maybe you get to figure that out, on your own terms this time." Her ears lifted slightly, just a fraction. Not hope yet, but the space where hope might grow. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his, and they stayed like that until the cold forced them back inside. Ceres disappeared into the forest the morning after her exile. Ethan woke to find her side of the bed cold, tracks leading away from the cabin into the deep woods. He didn't follow immediately. She needed space to wrestle with what she'd lost, and he understood the impulse to face grief alone. But he left a pack at the tree line, dried meat, water, a thermal blanket, and refreshed it each day. On the third day, Amara arrived with maps and warnings. She spread them across the kitchen table, pointing to locations circled in red. "Military installations here and here, corporate research facilities. If word gets out that an alien is loose in Alaska, this place becomes ground zero." She looked at him hard. "You want to protect her. You need to move. Somewhere remote, defensible. She's not exactly in a state to travel." "Then you'd better hope she comes back before someone else finds her." Amara softened slightly. "How are you holding up?" "I'm not the one who lost everything." "No, you're just the one she lost everything for. That's its own kind of weight." After Amara left, Ethan shouldered his pack and headed into the mountains. He found Ceres's trail by the broken branches and disturbed snow, following it upward through pine forests and across frozen streams. The air thinned as he climbed, each breath burning cold in his lungs. He found her on a ridge overlooking the valley, sitting with her knees drawn up and her tail wrapped around herself. She didn't turn when he approached, just kept staring at the sky where stars were beginning to emerge in the dusk. Her ears swiveled slightly, tracking his footsteps, but she said nothing. Ethan sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. The cold bit through his jacket. He waited. "I keep looking for their ships," she said finally. Her voice was raw, scraped hollow, searching the stars like they might change their minds. "Come back for me." "Would you go if they did?" "No." The word came quickly, surprising them both. She turned to look at him then, and something fragile lived in her eyes. "That is what frightens me. I do not know who I am without the collective, without my rank, my purpose, my people. I have been Kitsara my entire life. Now I am." She gestured helplessly, tail twitching in agitation. "Nothing." "You're someone who made a choice. Someone who decided her own path mattered more than someone else's code. And if I chose wrong, then you chose wrong, but it was yours to make." He shifted slightly, closing the distance between them. "Saris, you asked me once why I came out here, why I left everything behind." He looked at his hands, scarred and weathered. "I spent years following orders, being what the army needed me to be. Then one day I realized I'd lost track of who I was underneath all that. So I left. Came here to figure it out." "Did you?" "Not entirely, but I learned something." He met her gaze. "You don't find yourself by looking backward at what you were. You find yourself by choosing what matters and holding on." Her ears lifted slowly forward and focused entirely on him. "What matters to you?" "Right now, this. You." The words came easier than he expected. "I stayed because you mattered. Not because some code said I should, not because I owed you anything. I stayed because I wanted to." She reached for him, her hand finding his face, fingers tracing the line of his jaw with something like wonder. "I chose you because you taught me that choosing can be strength, that caring is not weakness." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I would choose you again." He caught her hand, pressed his lips to her palm. "Then maybe that's enough. Maybe that's who you are now, someone who chooses." She moved then, closing the distance between them, and kissed him. It was tentative at first, uncertain, but when he pulled her closer, she melted into him with fierce intensity. Her tail curled around his waist, pulling them together as her fingers threaded through his hair. He cupped her face, tilting her head to deepen the kiss, tasting the sharp intake of her breath. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, her ears were fully forward and her eyes bright. "Take me home," she whispered against his mouth. They walked back through the darkness, hands linked, her tail occasionally brushing against his leg. The cabin was warm when they entered, fire still burning from the morning's load. Saris turned to him, uncertainty flickering across her features. He saw the question there, "What happens now?" and answered it by pulling her close. They shed their outer layers slowly, each piece revealing more skin. Her body was lean muscle beneath pale flesh, elegant and alien and perfect. His hands shook slightly as they traced the curve of her spine, careful around the base of her tail where it joined her body. She shivered at the touch, ears flattening in pleasure rather than fear. They moved together toward the bed, and when they came together, it was with the desperate tenderness of two people who had found something worth keeping. Afterward, they lay tangled in blankets, her head on his chest and tail draped across both of them like a blanket. Her fingers traced absent patterns on his skin while he ran his hand through her hair, careful around the sensitive ears that twitched at his touch. "What do we do now?" she asked. "We survive, we adapt, we figure it out together." "Your people will come looking eventually, and mine?" she trailed off. "Then we deal with it when it comes." He kissed the top of her head, one day at a time. She tilted her face up to his, and for the first time since the exile, she smiled. It was small and fragile, but real. The next week, Cale returned. He came alone, landing his small scout craft in the clearing at dawn. Ethan had his rifle ready, but Cale emerged with hands raised and tail low in submission. Saris met him at the door, wary. "I cannot stay long," Cale said quickly. "But you should know. What you did is spreading. The younger generation questions why emotion must be weakness, why choosing love is betrayal." His ears flicked nervously. "The council calls you traitor, but others call you brave." "I did not do it for them." "I know, but change begins somewhere, with someone willing to step outside the code." He glanced at Ethan, then back to Saris. "You cannot return, but you are not forgotten." After he left, Sarah stood in the doorway watching the sky. Ethan came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Her tail curled around his leg automatically. "Do you regret it?" he asked. She leaned back into him, tilting her head until her ear brushed his jaw. "I regret nothing." They stood there as dawn broke over the mountains, two beings from different worlds who had found something neither expected. Not just love, but the freedom to choose it. Her tail wrapped around both of them as the sun rose, and Ethan held her close, this impossible creature who had crossed the stars and found something worth staying for. Whatever came next, they would face it together. That was enough.